What do European sailors, famous Soviet snipers, cliché depictions of Parisians, and Russian paratroopers all have in common? Stumped? Well, look closely at their shirts, and you'll see they all wore white undershirts with horizontal lines. Be it referred to as la marinière, the Breton jersey, or Telnyashka, the simple striped undershirt has become synonymous with numerous European navies, sailors, troops of all types, and even the fashion industry for well over 150 years. Chances are, if you've seen old paintings, illustrations, or photos of European sailors, be they naval or commercial, or newer pictures and video of Russian troops, you've likely caught at least a glimpse of some form of the striped shirt. Nowadays, these shirts, in the form of Telnyashka, are the most common, as they've become a standard issue item through much of the Russian armed forces and other agencies, but have also become something of a symbol through the country and even parts beyond. But where and why did something as simple as a striped shirt originate? Why has it become so popular and well used among sailors, navies, and even ground and air-based military forces? To best understand this, we must first look at the idea of striped garments in general. Though it's a bit hard to pinpoint the exact origin of striped clothing, some of the earliest cases came from Europe during the Middle Ages. It was here stripes were associated with outcasts and people on the fringes of society, such as criminals, the sick and dying, rogue warriors, executioners, prostitutes, and heretics, among many others. Adding to this, many of the Christian faith interpreted stripes as a symbol of evil and even Satan, which may have stemmed from Leviticus 19:19, which reads, "Keep my decrees. Do not mate different kinds of animals. Do not plant your fields with two kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material." Nowadays, a garment made up of two or more fabrics or material is commonplace, but back then such a thing was hard to come by, and even in the cases where clothing was, chances are it was hard to tell. But if you take the same piece of clothing and add stripes, one can see two different colors of fabric and interpret it as material, thus creating the stigma. Whatever the reason may be, the idea of stripes were taboo. But without diving too much into textile and fashion history, let's steer this back to uniforms. One of the most interesting early depictions of a striped uniform of sorts came by way of the 1474 manuscript Le Passage d'Outre-mer, une chronique des croisades jusqu'au 1462, also known as the Overseas Passages, or more simply, a Chronicle of the Crusades. A work that chronicles the stories of the Crusades by blending myth and fact, this manuscript featured 60 illustrations, many of which depicted warriors and more frequently sailors wearing striped clothing. Now you must be thinking, why would sailors wear clothing like that when there's all this controversy and pigeonholing surrounding stripes during that time? Well, there are a few reasons. First, chances are many simply didn't care, or were already considered on the fringes of society. With sailors living and working at sea, often putting their lives at risk, they frequently gained reputations of being low class, dirty, and so on. However, it appears that stripes were often chosen for their eye-catching tendencies. On the social side of things, it was used as a way to stand out while ashore for the purposes of flings, fights, or festivities. However, the most crucial usage of it came while out at sea. The effects of stripes causes the wearer to become highly visible, which was important while tending to duties on a ship, and perhaps most importantly if one were to fall overboard and into the water. To add to this, alternating blue and white or red and white stripes were among the most popular, as they apparently stood out the most, with the blue and white supposedly being chosen to represent the blue water and white foam of ocean waves. Over the next few centuries, many paintings, drawings, and illustrations of nautical scenes or locations that included sailors wearing either red and white or blue and white striped shirts or trousers were created throughout Europe and the Americas. As time continued on, the association with evil and stripes eventually faded out, being replaced first by wearers being associated with chaos, being different or odd, and then more positive ones such as wealth, in that the more intricate designs one boasted, the wealthier or classier they would be seen as, or freedom and liberty in the case of the American and French revolutions, often using red, white, and blue stripes. But as this evolution surrounding the design continued into the 1800s, sailors, be they private or a part of a country's navy, continued to sporadically wear striped clothing. That changed, though, on March 27, 1858, when new uniform regulations were passed by the French government, which included the distribution of a white long-sleeve shirt bearing blue horizontal stripes to sailors. However, where in the past pieces would be made on a case-by-case basis or simply purchased, these shirts weren't just arbitrarily created and thrown into use. Referred to as la marinière or tricot raillé, everything about these shirts seemed to have been thought out, from the design to the fabric and even the sizing and spacing of the stripes. Originally Usually made by individual tailors before ultimately being created through official channels, the regulations for these stated that they would be made of both wool and cotton, and that their stripes would be about 3/8 of an inch, or 10 millimeters wide, and spaced apart from one another by around 3/4 of an inch, or 20 millimeters. Additionally, the number of stripes were specified. The body shall have 21 white stripes, each twice as wide as the 20 or 21 navy blue stripes. It was also specified that each sleeve would have 14 or 15 stripes on it as well. Now, it has been said that the number of stripes were intentionally chosen to represent victories Napoleon Bonaparte and France had during the Napoleonic Wars. However, the exact number isn't easily determined. Whether this means just the blue or white, or both, and whether it's just the stripes on the torso or sleeves, or all combined, isn't really specified. Regardless though, victories can mean a number of different things depending on the source, with some claiming major victories, other naval victories, and even some general victories over the British, among a few others. Now, the design as far as the cut and alternating colors were viewed positively by their wearers, as once again, the stripes were said to help locate anyone who had fallen overboard, while the cut, specifically the boat neck collar, allowed for quick removal so the wearer could wave it around in the event of an emergency. Due to many sailors originating from Brittany, the westernmost peninsula region of France, the name of Breton quickly became associated with these garments. It wasn't long until these shirts began to catch on with European sailors and navies, granted in modified and altered versions that often saw the stripe's size and overall number change for purposes allegedly ranging from symbolizing shorelines to more superstitious things such as the 12 rows of human ribs as a way to trick death out at sea by showing that the wearer was already dead and decayed to nothing but bones. However, one of the biggest changes that these shirts saw was them breaking into fashion and everyday wear that took off in the late 1910s and early 1920s due to a number of different factors. By and large, the most significant was a new wave of modernist art and aesthetics which was sweeping through fashion. Squares, rectangles, and hard, clean-edged shapes were becoming very popular in many facets. Additionally, two big contributors that helped speed up its popularity were artist Gerald Murphy and fashion designer Coco Chanel, who both literally and figuratively pulled it out of nautical use and into the everyday for many. As it permeated into pop culture, many famous actors and celebrities ranging from Pablo Picasso and Gene Seberg to Audrey Hepburn, John Wayne, and James Dean were seen sporting them. To this day, these garments remain fashionable, though often in modified and altered styles, which keep the same overall striped look. One detriment to this popularity, however, was it becoming associated with the look of a cliché Frenchman alongside a beret, red ascot, baguette, and bottle of wine. It's also worth mentioning Marcel Marceau, a famous mime who began wearing a Breton, essentially making it synonymous with mimes. Anyway though, back to the seafaring side of things. By the mid-20th century, many navies had moved away from the Bretons, opting for an assortment of other pieces, though France would continue to use it up to the present day. Jumping back in time a bit though, it was around the 1860s the piece made its way into Russia, which would eventually spawn something much more widespread. Though some of the earliest sightings of the Breton in Russia came by way of foreign sailors disembarking in cities and villages around the White Sea such as Arkhangelsk and Holmogorny, the first noted usage of it among Russian sailors came by way of St. Petersburg. The story goes that in 1868, crew members of the Imperial screw frigate General Admiral were called up for review for the Grand Duke and Admiral Konstantin Nikolaevich. All the personnel that came out were wearing matching Breton-style shirts, which they had purchased in Europe while on a recent deployment. Many expressed their favoritism of them, boasting their comfort and functionality, which left an impression on Nikolaevich, who then has been alleged to have mentioned this to Tsar Alexander II, who in turn included it as a part of a uniform reform decree on August 19, 1874. A factor that also may have helped with its official adoption was its blue and white colors that almost matched the ones used by the St. Andrew flag, which had been the primary ensign used by the Imperial Navy since 1712. Regardless, for the first 30 or so years of usage among the Russian Navy, it was pretty much just another part of their uniform. That changed though in 1905 after the end of the Russo-Japanese War. This was a conflict which saw Russia attempt to establish a warm water port in northeastern Asia, resulting in Japan reacting as it was concerned that they would encroach upon their own goals of expansionism. After a little over a year and a half of both naval and ground warfare, Japan claimed victory, resulting in a drop in the Tsar's prestige and a decent level of demoralization among many Russian forces. As large numbers of sailors returned to home ports sporting the Breton-style shirts, they filled bars, restaurants, and other establishments where they retold stories and exploits of the war and partook in general revelry. Because of this massive influx, the public became familiarized with the shirt and its design, which in turn made it synonymous with the sea and the spirit of naval sailors. By 1912, the Bretons had slightly been altered into what is essentially today's Telnyashka, meaning body shirt or vest, which standardized the width of the stripes to around 7/16 of an inch, or just under 11 millimeters, as well as downplaying the supposed symbolism surrounding their specific numbers. Come 1917, these shirts gained a new level of significance due to the February and October revolutions seen that year. Seeing many forces of the imperial military join in the protests, one group that was the most eye-catching were sailors due to their vibrant uniforms. As these uprisings led to the Russian Revolution and eventually Russian Civil War, the Baltic Fleet became a staunch enemy of the Tsar and formed a significant element of Bolshevik forces. In no time, the symbol of the well-dressed and determined sailor boasting the Telnyashka was known across the land, both because of actual sailors as well as propaganda in the form of posters and banners of all sorts. After the war and the defeat of the White Army and its supporters, the Soviet Union was established. The Telnyashka remained mostly untouched as it had by now become something of an icon of the revolution and a staple of the Soviet Navy, not to mention its continued favoritism and practicality among its wearers. Its prestige would become even more cemented among the populace during this time thanks to the movies such as 1925's Battleship Potemkin and 1936's The Sailors of Kronstadt, both of which featured sailors rebelling or fighting against the corrupt establishment or enemies of popular movements. However, as the 1920s turned to the 1930s, a number of reforms and purges among the military occurred, which would directly impact the future of the shirt. Because of these actions, many branches of the military, specifically the Army, ended up in a somewhat weakened state as far as numbers and leadership, which would become obvious in June of 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the surprise German invasion of the Soviet Union. With the Red Army unprepared and in the condition it was in, the Germans were able to push eastward as far as Moscow before ultimately being repulsed by a counteroffensive. Now, to successfully meet the Germans and push them back, the Soviets had to pull forces from other branches by way of volunteers or transfers to bolster the army and create new ground-based units. This is where the Telnyashka would come into play and once again become something of a national symbol of the Soviet Union and the Russian people. The Navy played a big factor in the war as many sailors volunteered to be transferred into the Army or were reassigned into newly formed infantry or rifle units. Among many of these shifting forces was a Vladivostok-based naval clerk of the Pacific Fleet by the name of Vasily Zaitsev. Soon to become one of the most effective and deadly snipers of the war, he, upon his transfer to the army, never gave up his Telnyashka due to the prestige and significance it held. As more and more naval personnel became ground-based infantry in the war, the striped shirt became more and more used in Western Russia, which caused a bit of an indirect psychological effect against German troops. When fighting against naval-based forces, the Germans took notice and began referring to the shirts as either gestreifter Teufel or gestreifter Tod, meaning striped devils or striped death. This appears to have stemmed from a few different reasons, the main ones being the ferocity in which many fought, as well as the harkening back to the medieval stigma surrounding stripes. However, with the alternating colors, a sort of distortion effect would also occasionally appear, which not only made it hard to distinguish the exact distance of wearers, but also sometimes gave the illusion of more forces than there actually were. This in turn helped to contribute to the rise of the saying, "We are few in number, but we wear Telnyashkas." But with the pieces making their way beyond the Navy into various other branches through the end of the war, the idea of officially adopting it for other units started to increase. One major one was that of paratroopers. It was also around this time the Airborne Corps was beginning to take shape. With the war ending, the unit continued to develop and establish itself as a fully fledged corps. Enter General Vasily Margolov, who, in 1954, was appointed as the commander of the airborne forces, known as the Vazdushno-Desantnye Vaiska, or VDV for short. Under his command, he helped develop and update the entire force. One such way was by adopting the Telnyashka. Due to a mix of World War II veterans already wearing it and the airborne starting to really ramp up water jumps around the late 1950s, the shirt began to become something of an unofficially issued item. With the shirt's association still firmly with the Navy and a few powerful officials wanting to keep it that way, the adoption of such a significant item did not come overnight, and so Margolov continued to push for its use among paratroopers, even going on record during military council meetings stating things like, "I want the paratroopers to adopt the glorious traditions of their elder brother, the Marines, and continue them with honor. For this, I introduced the vests to the paratroopers. Only the stripes on them match the color of the sky. blue. His love of the shirt began during the Second World War when he was put in charge of a number of different units. One of his earliest was that of the 1st Special Ski Regiment, which was made up of volunteer sailors from the Red Banner Baltic Fleet. Seeing their capabilities in battle, as well as many wearing their striped shirts, sometimes blatantly exposed when their coats were unbuttoned during combat, Margolov was left impressed not only with them, but the significance that Telnyashka had. It is worth noting, however, that there is a small rumor that rugby also helped influence Margolov's push for an airborne Telnyashka. The 1950s and 60s brought about the revival of the sport within the USSR, seeing it become particularly popular among many troops. Margolov was one of them. It has been said that after watching 1963's This Sporting Life, a British film about a troubled up-and-coming rugby player, which had almost a cult status among many Soviet officers, Margolov personally saw to the creation of a rugby training program for the Airborne Corps. Throughout the movie, numerous players are seen wearing striped jerseys which, some have speculated, caused Margolov to become more adamant about an airborne version of the Telnyashka. Whether this alleged reason is true or not, in 1969 the Ministry of Defense's Order 191 officially sanctioned the creation and usage of the new airborne Telnyashka, which saw the darker blue stripes change to a lighter, almost sky blue shade, and them appearing in 3 versions. A sleeveless cotton version for the summer and warmer months, a regular sleeved version made of cotton for the spring and autumn seasons, and a sleeved cotton-wool blend for the winter and colder months. To add to that, the same order saw the creation and distribution of new uniforms for all ground-based units, which soon became known as the M69 uniform. However, paratroopers received the jacket with a slightly different collar, which was designed to be worn open rather than buttoned up to the neck, for the specific purpose of showing off their new undershirts. Additionally, that same year, matching light blue berets were introduced, essentially giving the VDV a massive jump in overall look and identity uniform-wise. With these new shirts becoming very popular among the airborne, it wasn't long until they, much like the original naval version, spread to other branches and troops. This was most evident during the Soviet-Afghan War, where many infantry and armored forces began wearing them, which led to a bit of animosity between some airborne and ground forces within the country that even, on occasion, ended in actual physical confrontations. But with the Telnyashkas spreading to different branches and agencies, it wasn't long until they would evolve even further. Though there is some debate as to the exact start date of this, some say before the collapse of the Soviet Union, with others saying after, a number of altered versions began to appear that saw the stripes change color based on agencies, branches, and units, and their overall duties. Now, it's worth noting colors aside from blue, such as green and red, had been used to an extent prior, mainly to differentiate members of different naval groups during the Russian Empire, but the concept was abandoned somewhere along the line. Anyway, let's take a quick look at what colors there were and who used them. Obviously, to start is the Navy's dark blue ocean version, which can be traced back to 1874. This type is also used by submarine crews as well as naval infantry, also known as Marines. However, sometimes versions worn by them will appear almost black in color, which has led to a bit of confusion, with many saying it's caused by fading or differences due to manufacturing, with others saying they are actually black. Then you have the lighter sky blue for airborne forces. Border Guards adopted one with a forest green type color. A rose madder red, which appears similar to maroon, began being used by forces such as internal troops of the MVD or Ministry of Internal Affairs until a 2016 restructuring. Afterwards, these red versions began being seen among National Guard troops as well as special units of the Police of Russia, or Oman. A cornflower blue variant, which appears very close in color to the airborne one, though with a slightly grayer hue, is worn by members of the Kremlin Regiment of the Federal Protective Service, or FSO, and finally a bright safety orange for EMERCOM, or units of the Ministry of Emergency Situations. Now, it's important to bring up 2 things. First was that though these colors are often associated with said units or branches, there also appears to be a level of crossover among many forces. Second, which sort of stems from this, is that many other units not mentioned have been known to wear Telnyashkas in the field due to them essentially being an undershirt, which is often covered up by the primary uniform components. Jumping back a little though, with all these striped shirts becoming more and more common among the Soviet armed forces, many within and outside the Union began to take notice of it, and soon a few new uses and even stereotypes were born. Inside Russia, the shirt picked up popularity among the public for 2 main reasons. The first was that it not only became associated with honor and a sense of independence and strength, but also rebellion and almost rowdiness. In many movies and other media, characters who were troublemakers or problematic to others often were seen wearing some form of the Telnyashka. On the other hand, it was also adopted as the primary garment garment of the St. Petersburg-based art group Mitki. This group advocates the ideals of positivity and optimism, which is often expressed in their works, be they writings, short films, or art, much of which also incorporates the classic white and blue Telnyashka. Adding to this, there are 3 holidays and celebrations that incorporate the piece. The first and second are Navy Day, July 25th, which sees many participants wear the naval Telnyashka, and August 19th, Telnyashka Day, which is the anniversary of the official decree which made the shirt a piece of the Navy's uniform. But perhaps the most famous is August 2nd, known as Airborne Forces Day, which honors all active and retired paratroopers. Often veterans will be seen throughout the country sporting their Telnyashkas as they come together to partake in festivities. Moving outside of Russia, a trope took shape in many forms of Western media of the tough, buff, often sadistic or unhinged Russian who would frequently be wearing some version of the Telnyashka. As far as the piece's actual travels in an official capacity, it has made its way to many other countries that were either aligned, friendly, a part of, or supported by the Soviet Union at one point or another, which includes but is not limited to China, Cuba, Ukraine, Belarus, North Korea, Vietnam, and Bulgaria. The Telnyashka, though now numerous in colors, styles, and usages, has become a staple among many branches and units of the Russian armed forces and beyond. It survived and even flourished after the collapse of the Soviet Union and has made a name for itself, even if many don't know it by its actual name. And that more or less covers the rather bizarre yet extensive and unique history of the utilization of striped garments among many navies and militaries. A very special thanks to researcher, collector, and soon-to-be author Vlad Besedovsky, who helped provide information and photos for the Telnyashka section of the video. With a focus on Soviet equipment, weapons, and uniforms from the late Soviet era, Vlad is currently hard at work putting together a book on the history and uniforms of the VDV during the Russian war in Afghanistan. He currently has a Kickstarter campaign running to help fund the creation and publishing of it, link to which can be found in the description below. Now, we did touch on the general origin and history, but there is quite a bit more to it than what was mentioned. Hopefully though, this video has shed a bit of light on the significance and beginnings of the Bretons and Telnyashkas, along with their numerous iterations, offshoots, and usages. If you enjoyed the video, why not leave a like and subscribe? If not, that's perfectly fine. Just be sure to check back soon for more of the history of videos right here on Uniform History.